Thomas Carlyle said that the study of history is nothing more than the study of great men and women. Moses led the Jewish people out of slavery and into freedom. This particular book, In Pursuit of Leadership by Morris, is about Moses. What a great story. If you'll remember, he was a baby that was almost killed. He grew up and was adopted as a prince in the palace of a pharaoh. He was on the run for 40 years. He murdered someone. He led God's people, crossed the Red Sea, followed a pillar of fire, all the many plagues. The original burning bush experience, we'll use that slang or terminology, as having a burning bush experience. He was 80 years old when he had that. He was alone and spent time with God, and he was the only man to see God face to face. We see his successes and his failures, his fear and his faith, his triumph and his tragedy. He was an advocate for his followers. He pleaded with the Lord. They were stubborn, stiff-necked people, not naked as in naked, stiff-necked. Their necks were stiff. They were grumblers, they were complainers, they weren't good followers. They danced around the golden calf, even after they'd heard from God. They lacked faith, yet Moses was always an advocate, and God listened to his pleas time and time again. He was compassionate and listened to the people. Paul Tillich, a great theologian, said, "The first duty of love is to listen." So Moses had vision. Yes, the burning bush experience. The vision was deliverance from Egypt, leading the people to the promised land. He probably didn't have the vision or mission on a laminated card, but he had a vision and went through a long period of preparation. Preparation is not a one-time event. It's not a one-time laying on of hands or a miracle, but God can do miracles and commission people, but there is a time for preparation, and it's a process. And Moses went through a long period of preparation. He was in the desert 40 years. He received royal privileges and extensive education and training, so he was pretty blessed. He was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds, it says in Acts. But he had to flee Egypt after his failure, after his murder, and yet it was during the next 40 years that God prepared him. He was shepherding. The Lord knew him, the Bible says. The Lord knew him face to face. He was known as the man of God. He was known as the friend of God. He was humble and afraid. He said, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" He was the most humble man on earth, it says in Numbers. He brought the people, he led the people to meet with God, Exodus 19:17 says. So he didn't leave them to their own doings. He led them to God. He led them out of Egypt. He did supernatural miracles with God at his side. God never said, "Moses, my leader." What did he say? "Moses, my servant." Servant leader. So that time of preparation was not just one event, but you look at that process. It made a great movie. Noah. Noah waited 120 years before the rain came. Abraham waited 25 years for Sarah to give birth. Joseph served time for a crime he didn't commit for 13 years. Job waited 50 years plus for God's justice. So he patiently and purposefully prepares his people. I'm not discouraging you from expecting radical, life-changing, world-changing things next week, but I am asking you to be realistic. And if God delays, it's okay. Be patient. Let him shape you and mold you. Be like clay. Moses spent the first 40 years learning and training. Then he killed someone, fled, and was a shepherd for 40 years. Was in the wilderness 80 years before he was mightily used. And talk about crisis leadership. Pharaohs, plagues, Red Sea experiences. The process builds the best product. Moses got ahead of God and tried to take matters into his own hands by killing the Egyptian. Ishmael was the result of Abraham's impatience with God. How did that turn out? So the first 80 years molded Moses and prepared him for the impact later in his life. Hebrews 11, he gets more New Testament verses in the Faith Hall of Fame than anyone. He was a man of faith, was Moses, and yet he chose to be a servant leader. One of the great undersung scriptures on servant leadership, Hebrews 11:25. He chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. You think of the life that Moses could have chosen. He had everything in the palace, the prince of Egypt. And yet he chose to be with God's people, to lead a bunch of grumblers and complainers to the promised land. Leadership is a marathon, not a sprint. Moses learned to delegate. Delegation is not always taught. It's mostly trial and error, seeing what you're willing to delegate. But it may be the most important leadership skill, as you can't multiply yourself. He not only delegated, but he prayed for them. It says in Exodus 32 and Numbers 14, he talked to God all the time about the followers. He was patient, courageous, consistent, determined, yet disillusioned and drained, but was persistent. He was not a quitter. He had stick-to-itness. He didn't give up. Oftentimes the people didn't want his leadership. They rejected his leadership quite often. They wanted to go back to Egypt. Great song by Keith Green called "Do You Want to Go Back to Egypt?" Amazing song. Moses had his mountaintop experiences, but most of his time he was an unwanted, frustrated leader. Imagine leading a people for 37 and a half years. You're ready to achieve your goal and the organization's goal, and they don't want it. They didn't want to go to the promised land. Look at Numbers 13 through 19 and Numbers 33. What a great story. Had to be frustrating. Moses mentored and modeled. You look at Joshua, became a great leader. Leaders need to reproduce leaders. Leaders don't create followers, they create more leaders. Moses failed. He had anger issues. He lost his faith at times. God said, "You didn't believe me." Numbers 20:12 says that's why he couldn't enter the promised land. He didn't believe. So he was a man of faith and a servant leader, but he didn't always have faith. The only way to avoid failure is to avoid trying. Would Moses today be viewed as a failure if you stacked up his accomplishments and failures on a spreadsheet? He didn't fully achieve his goal in his lifetime. He had many big fails, yet he was faithful and obedient and called a friend of God, and God had used him mightily. He was a prophet, a lawgiver, an intercessor, and a leader. His legacy with Joshua and Caleb was an amazing legacy. I love the D.L. Moody statement. He said, Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. Leadership is a privilege. Don't try and be Moses. Don't try and be your neighbor. Don't try and be your parent. Don't try and be your boss. Be who God created you to be.